Behind closed doors, Tony and Ziva's Midnight Romance, NCIS Season 24. The lights of Washington, D.C. shimmered against the rain-soaked streets as midnight settled over the city. Inside NCIS headquarters, the halls that had buzzed with investigators only hours earlier now stood silent. Most of the team had gone home, leaving behind stacks of unfinished reports and the faint glow of computer monitors. Tony DiNozzo leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes after another exhausting day. The latest case had pushed everyone to their limits, but one person refused to leave until every detail was accounted for: Ziva David. She stood across the room, quietly organizing evidence files with the same determination that had always made her one of the agency's greatest agents. Tony smiled to himself. Some things never changed. "You know," Tony finally said, breaking the silence, "it's after midnight. Even Gibbs would have told us to go home by now." Without looking up, Ziva answered with a faint smile. "Perhaps you are getting old, Tony." "Ouch!" She laughed softly, a sound he hadn't heard nearly enough over the years. After everything they had survived, the betrayals, dangerous missions, years apart, and countless close calls, they had learned something important. Life was too short to waste another moment. Tony walked over and gently placed the final folder into the cabinet. "There," he said. "Officially finished." Ziva looked around the quiet office. "It feels strange." "What does?" "Peace." Tony nodded. For years, peace had been something neither of them truly believed existed. Every victory had been followed by another mission. Every reunion had been interrupted by another crisis. Tonight felt different. No alarms, no gunfire, no countdown. Just two people finally sharing a quiet moment. As they stepped outside, cool rain drifted through the air. Instead of rushing toward the parking garage, Tony reached for Ziva's hand. She looked at him with surprise. "You still do this." "I plan on doing it forever." Together they walked through the nearly empty streets, passing glowing cafes and silent monuments bathed in moonlight. Washington seemed to belong only to them. Tony suddenly stopped outside a tiny bakery that remained open through the night. "I have an idea." Ziva raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" "Absolutely." Minutes later, they sat by the window sharing fresh pastries and coffee while watching the rain fall. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't expensive, but somehow it felt perfect. Tony looked across the table. "You remember Paris?" "I remember you getting lost." "I was exploring." "You walked in circles for 40 minutes." "I eventually found the restaurant." "After asking 3 tourists for directions." Tony laughed. "Okay, maybe I got a little lost." Their conversation drifted through memories that stretched across decades. Funny missions, embarrassing mistakes, friends they had lost, victories they had almost forgotten. Each story reminded them how impossible their journey had seemed, and yet somehow they were here, still together, still laughing. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Eventually, they returned to their apartment overlooking the city skyline. The storm had faded, leaving the streets sparkling beneath the streetlights. Inside, everything felt calm. No emergency calls, no classified briefings, no looming danger. Tony walked onto the balcony while Ziva joined him with 2 steaming mugs of tea. The cool night breeze carried the distant sounds of the city. "Do you ever miss it?" Tony asked. "The field?" He nodded. Ziva thought carefully before answering. "I miss the purpose." Tony understood. "So do I. But I do not miss wondering if today would be my last." He looked toward the stars. "I definitely don't miss getting shot." She smiled. "That happened more often than it should have." "You noticed?" "I noticed everything." The words lingered between them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Tony quietly admitted something he had carried for years. "There were so many times I wanted to tell you how I felt." Ziva's eyes softened. "I know. I was scared. I know that too. I thought I would lose you." "You almost did." Silence returned, not uncomfortable, just honest. Tony reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small silver key. Ziva looked confused. What is this? Our old storage locker. You kept it? I never got around to cleaning it out. She laughed. You are impossible. The next morning, they unlocked the forgotten storage room. Dust-covered old boxes filled with photographs, souvenirs, movie tickets, mission files cleared for release, and countless reminders of a lifetime together. Tony uncovered an old basketball. You remember this? You insisted you could beat McGee. I almost did. You lost by 12. It was closer than that. It truly was not. Another box revealed an old camera. Tony switched it on. To his surprise, it still worked. He pointed it toward Ziva. Smile. She immediately covered her face. No. Come on. I dislike photographs. You love photographs. I tolerate them. He captured the picture anyway. She rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her smile. Hours later, they left the storage room carrying only one small box. Inside were the memories worth keeping. Everything else belonged to the past. As evening arrived once again, Tony and Ziva returned home. The city below bustled with life while stars slowly appeared overhead. Tony placed the memory box onto a shelf beside framed family photos. It finally belongs here, he said. Ziva rested her head against his shoulder. Yes, for years they had lived separate lives connected only by unfinished conversations and impossible timing. Now those chapters were finally complete. No secret missions, no impossible choices, no painful goodbyes, only tomorrow. Tony wrapped an arm around her as they watched the skyline together. You know, he whispered, people always expected some dramatic ending for us. Ziva smiled warmly. They were wrong. Why? Because the greatest stories do not end with explosions. They don't? No? Then how do they end? She looked into his eyes before answering. They end with peace. Tony smiled. I like that ending. So do I. The clock quietly passed midnight once again. Behind the closed doors of their home, there were no legendary agents, no international operatives, and no famous investigators. There were simply Tony and Ziva, two people who had finally discovered that the greatest adventure was not chasing criminals across the world. It was finding a place where they could finally stop running, laugh together, and welcome each new day side by side. And for the first time in a very long time, tomorrow held no mystery, only hope. Behind closed doors, Tony and Ziva's midnight romance, NCIS Season 24, Part 2, A Knock in the Night. The peaceful silence that had settled over Tony and Ziva's home didn't last forever. Just before dawn, Tony was awakened by the faint vibration of his phone on the bedside table. He glanced at the screen. The caller ID simply read, NCIS Director. He sighed. So much for a quiet morning. Trying not to wake Ziva, Tony slipped out of bed and answered in a hushed voice. Dinozo. Sorry to interrupt, the director said. We have an unusual situation. A former intelligence asset has disappeared after requesting protection. Before vanishing, he left one message. Tony frowned. What message? He specifically asked for you and Ziva. The line went silent for a moment. Tony looked toward the bedroom, where Ziva was now standing in the doorway. She had heard enough to understand. Another mission? She asked. Tony nodded reluctantly. It seems that way. An hour later, the couple arrived at NCIS headquarters. The familiar bullpen looked almost unchanged despite the passing years. Agents hurried between desks, computer screens displayed incoming reports, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the room. For a brief moment, it felt as though they had stepped back in time. Director Leon Vance greeted them in the conference room. I'm grateful you came. Tony smiled. I had a feeling retirement wasn't going to last. Vance slid a classified folder across the table. Our missing asset is Daniel Mercer. Ziva's expression shifted immediately. I know that name. So do I, Tony admitted. Mercer had once worked deep undercover against an international smuggling network, before disappearing into witness protection. According to the file, someone had recently discovered his new identity. He contacted us yesterday, Vance explained. He believed someone from his past was hunting him. What happened next? Tony asked. He vanished 12 hours later. Ziva carefully studied the photographs. No signs of forced entry. No ransom demand. Nothing. Tony leaned back. Then Mercer walked away willingly, or someone convinced him to. Vance nodded. Exactly. The investigation led Tony and Ziva to an abandoned marina on the edge of the Potomac River. Rain clouds gathered overhead as they searched the deserted docks. Everything seemed abandoned, until Ziva noticed fresh footprints leading toward an old warehouse. She motioned quietly. Tony understood immediately. Some instincts never faded. The two moved silently through the shadows, checking every corner with practiced precision. Inside the warehouse, they found overturned furniture, scattered documents, and evidence of a struggle. Tony crouched beside a broken chair. This happened recently. Ziva picked up a spent shell casing. Very recently. A sudden metallic sound echoed upstairs. Both agents froze. Tony whispered, "Did you hear that?" "I did." Without another word, they climbed the narrow staircase. Halfway up, a masked figure burst through a side door. The stranger sprinted across the upper walkway. "Stop!" Tony shouted. Instead, the figure leaped through a broken window onto the rooftop beyond. Tony and Ziva gave chase. The pursuit carried them across rain-slick rooftops overlooking the river. Despite the years away from fieldwork, they moved together with remarkable coordination. Tony cut off one escape route while Ziva closed in from the opposite side. For a second, it appeared the suspect was trapped. Then smoke exploded between them. Visibility vanished. By the time the haze cleared, the stranger was gone. Tony shook his head. Whoever that was came prepared. Ziva looked toward the distant skyline, and they knew we would follow. Back at NCIS, forensic analysts examined everything recovered from the warehouse. Among the scattered papers was an old photograph. Tony stared at it for several seconds. "I know this place." The picture showed a small countryside cabin surrounded by pine trees. Ziva looked closer. "You've been there? Years ago?" "When?" "During one of my first undercover assignments." Vance crossed his arms. "You never mentioned it." "It wasn't important then." Tony paused. "But it might be now." The cabin sat nearly 3 hours outside Washington. As dusk settled over the forest, Tony parked their vehicle along a narrow dirt road. "This is as close as we can get." The remaining distance had to be covered on foot. The woods were eerily quiet. Even the birds seemed absent. Tony noticed something strange. "No animal tracks." Ziva nodded. "Someone has been keeping this area clear." They approached cautiously. The cabin appeared abandoned from the outside. Broken shutters, weathered walls, a collapsed porch, but inside, someone had been living there recently. Fresh food sat on the kitchen counter. A lantern still burned. Maps covered one wall. In the center of the room stood Daniel Mercer, alive. He looked exhausted but relieved. "I knew you'd come." Tony lowered his weapon. "Why disappear?" Mercer glanced nervously toward the windows. "Because I couldn't trust anyone." "You can trust NCIS." "I wish that were true." Those words instantly changed the atmosphere. "What do you mean?" Ziva asked. Mercer hesitated before answering. "The people hunting me aren't just criminals." Tony exchanged a worried look with Ziva. "They have access to government intelligence." The room fell silent. Mercer continued. "They know classified operations. They know witness locations. They even know which agents are assigned to protect them." Tony felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying there's a leak?" Mercer slowly nodded. "Someone powerful has been feeding information to the wrong people." Before anyone could respond, a laser sight suddenly appeared on the cabin wall, then another and another. Ziva reacted instantly. "Down!" The windows exploded inward as gunfire shattered the silence. Tony pulled Mercer behind heavy furniture while Ziva returned controlled fire toward the tree line. Outside, dark figures surrounded the cabin from every direction. Tony counted at least 6 attackers, maybe more. They found us. Mercer looked terrified. I told you they would. The attackers advanced with military precision, closing the distance one careful step at a time. Tony checked his remaining ammunition. Not enough. Ziva reloaded calmly. We have survived worse. Tony smiled despite the danger. You always know exactly what to say. She gave him a determined glance. We leave together. No matter what. Outside, another burst of gunfire ripped through the cabin walls. The attackers were getting closer, and for the first time since returning to NCIS, Tony realized this wasn't simply another investigation. Someone had planned every move. Someone had expected Tony and Ziva to come out of retirement, and someone wasn't going to let them leave the forest alive. Behind closed doors, Tony and Ziva's Midnight Romance, NCIS Season 24. Part 3. The longest night, splintered wood and shattered glass filled the cabin as another volley of gunfire tore through the walls. Tony crouched beside a window, carefully peering through a narrow gap. They're spreading out, he whispered. They're trying to force us toward the back door. Ziva checked the room with a quick glance. They want us alive. Tony looked at her. You think so? They have had several opportunities to destroy this cabin completely. Instead, they are closing in slowly. Mercer nodded nervously. That's how they work. Tony's eyes narrowed. They're waiting for us to make a mistake. Outside, heavy rain began to fall, reducing visibility across the forest. The attackers adjusted their positions, using the darkness as cover. Inside, Tony studied an old map hanging on the wall. There. Ziva followed his finger. A narrow maintenance tunnel, once used decades earlier by forestry workers, stretched beneath the hillside behind the cabin. If it's still open, Tony said, it gives us one chance. Mercer swallowed hard. And if it collapsed? Tony forced a grin. Then we'll think of another terrible idea. Despite the danger, Ziva smiled. Some things never change. Tony tossed a smoke grenade through the shattered front window. The thick clouds spread instantly. The attackers responded with rapid gunfire, believing the 3 fugitives were making a desperate escape. Instead, Tony led Ziva and Mercer toward the hidden trapdoor beneath a worn-out rug in the kitchen. With considerable effort, they lifted the rusted metal hatch. A cold draft rushed upward. It still exists, Tony whispered. The tunnel was narrow, damp, and almost completely dark. They climbed down one after another, quietly pulling the hatch closed above them. Moments later, footsteps thundered through the cabin. Voices echoed overhead. They're gone! Search every room! The hunters were only a few feet away, unaware their targets had disappeared beneath them. The tunnel stretched farther than expected. Water dripped steadily from the stone ceiling as the 3 moved carefully through the darkness. Tony switched on a small flashlight. This place feels like something out of one of my old movies. Ziva glanced sideways. Please do not compare this to another adventure film. I wasn't going to say Indiana Jones. You were absolutely going to say Indiana Jones. Tony smiled, maybe a little. Even Mercer managed a nervous laugh. For a brief moment, the fear eased. Half an hour later, the tunnel opened onto the edge of the forest nearly a mile from the cabin. Fresh air filled their lungs. We made it, Mercer said. Tony looked around. Not yet. A black SUV suddenly appeared on the nearby road, then another. Their headlights swept across the trees. They predicted the tunnel, Ziva said quietly. They're smarter than we thought. Without hesitation, the 3 disappeared deeper into the woods. As dawn approached, they reached an abandoned fire watchtower overlooking the valley. From the top platform, Tony could see the search teams below. They've blocked every road. Mercer leaned against the railing. I told you this organization has resources. Tony turned toward him. You've been hiding something. Mercer hesitated. I was hoping I wouldn't have to tell you. Now's the time. Mercer reached inside his jacket and removed a small encrypted data drive. I didn't disappear because I was afraid. Tony frowned. You disappeared because of that? Mercer nodded. This contains years of classified financial records. What kind of records? Payments. From whom? Mercer's expression grew serious. Someone inside the intelligence community has been secretly financing international criminal organizations. Tony's face hardened. This isn't just corruption. No, it's treason. Ziva carefully examined the drive. If this information is genuine, it could expose dozens of people. Mercer nodded slowly. Some of the most respected names in government. Tony looked toward the horizon. No wonder they're trying to silence you. Before they could plan their next move, Tony's phone vibrated. The screen displayed an encrypted NCIS emergency frequency. He answered cautiously. Denozo. A familiar voice responded. Don't say anything. Tony immediately recognized it. Timothy McGee. We've intercepted unusual communications, McGee continued. Someone inside the agency is feeding your location to the attackers. Tony's expression changed instantly. You confirmed it? Yes? Can you identify who? Not yet. Static interrupted the transmission. Then McGee spoke one final sentence. Whatever you do, don't trust anyone until I call again. The connection died. Tony slipped the phone back into his pocket. The leak is real. Ziva nodded. And now they know we know. At that exact moment, a sniper's bullet shattered the watchtower railing only inches from Mercer's shoulder. Move! Tony shouted. More shots followed. The tower echoed with splintering wood. The attackers had found them again. Tony, Ziva, and Mercer raced down the narrow staircase as bullets ripped through the structure behind them. Halfway down, one of the wooden supports exploded. The tower began to collapse. Tony grabbed Mercer's arm while Ziva leaped across the widening gap. The platform gave way seconds later, crashing into the forest below. Dust and broken timber filled the air. They barely escaped before the entire watchtower collapsed behind them. Breathing heavily, Tony looked back at the wreckage. They're getting closer every time. They know our patterns, Ziva replied. They anticipate our decisions. Mercer looked exhausted. Because someone keeps telling them. As sunrise painted the sky with shades of gold, the three reached an isolated riverside dock. An old fishing boat rocked gently against the pier. Tony untied the ropes. This should buy us some time. The engine sputtered once, twice, then finally roared to life. They pushed away from shore just as several black vehicles emerged from the forest. Gunfire echoed across the river. Bullets skipped across the water behind them. Tony steered through the morning mist while Ziva kept watch from the stern. Gradually, the shoreline disappeared. For the first time in hours, silence returned. Tony glanced toward Ziva. We're still in this together. She smiled despite everything they had endured. Always. But neither of them noticed the tiny blinking light attached beneath the rear of the boat. Hidden behind the propeller was a sophisticated GPS tracker placed there sometime during the chaos at the cabin. Someone wasn't merely chasing them anymore. Someone was leading the hunt. And wherever Tony, Ziva, and Mercer went next, their enemies would already be waiting. Behind closed doors, Tony and Ziva's midnight romance. NCIS, Season 24, Part 4, The Betrayal Within. Morning fog drifted across the river as Tony guided the fishing boat away from the shoreline. The engine hummed steadily, masking the tension that hung over the three passengers. For nearly an hour, no one spoke. Mercer sat quietly, clutching the encrypted drive that had become the center of an international conspiracy. Ziva scanned the shoreline through a pair of binoculars, watching for any sign they had been followed. Tony finally broke the silence. They gave up too easily. They did, Ziva agreed. That concerns me. Mercer looked up. You think they're still tracking us? Tony didn't answer immediately. His instincts had kept him alive for years, and those instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. He slowed the boat near an abandoned boathouse hidden beneath overgrown trees. We're stopping. Mercer looked confused. But this place isn't on the map. Exactly. The old boathouse had clearly been deserted for years. Dust covered the wooden floor, and broken fishing nets hung from rusted hooks. Tony carefully searched every corner while Ziva inspected the boat. Suddenly, she froze. Tony, he walked over. What did you find? Without saying a word, she pointed beneath the stern. A tiny blinking device was attached beside the propeller. Tony's face darkened. A GPS tracker. Mercer stared in disbelief. It wasn't there before. No, Ziva replied calmly. Someone placed it during the firefight. Tony removed the tracker with a pocket knife and held it in his hand. They've known exactly where we've been. He looked toward the river. Let's give them one last location. A few minutes later, Tony secured the tracker inside an empty fuel barrel and pushed it into the current. The barrel slowly floated downstream. If they're watching, Tony said with a grin, they'll be chasing a very expensive piece of junk. Inside the boathouse, Tony finally received another encrypted call. McGee. It's me, Tim whispered. I don't have much time. Were you able to identify the leak? I traced several unauthorized file accesses. And they all lead back to someone with top-level clearance. Tony frowned. Who? McGee hesitated. I can't confirm it yet. Every time I get close, the records disappear. Someone's cleaning the system. Exactly. McGee lowered his voice even further. Listen carefully. Don't return to headquarters. Someone is waiting for you there. The line suddenly filled with static. Then it went dead. Tony slipped the phone into his jacket. We're on our own. Ziva nodded. Then we proceed as we always have. Carefully. And together. Mercer opened the encrypted drive using a portable laptop hidden inside his backpack. Hundreds of classified files appeared. Bank transfers, satellite images, operation logs, encrypted communications. Tony's eyes widened. This is enormous! Mercer clicked another folder. A list of code names appeared. One immediately caught Tony's attention. Midnight Falcon. What's that? He asked. Mercer took a deep breath. A covert operation that officially never existed. Ziva leaned closer. I've never heard of it. Very few people have. Mercer opened another document. It wasn't designed to eliminate terrorists. What was its purpose? To create them. Silence filled the room. Tony stared at the screen. You're saying intelligence officers secretly funded criminal organizations? Mercer nodded. They supplied money, weapons, and information to manipulate conflicts around the world. For political influence? Yes. And anyone who learned the truth disappeared. Tony slowly closed the laptop. If this becomes public, it could destroy careers. Mercer shook his head. It could destroy governments. That afternoon, Ziva suggested contacting one person she still trusted completely, former Mossad officer Rivka Halevi. Although retired, Rivka had spent decades exposing corruption inside international intelligence agencies. If anyone can verify these files, Ziva said, it is her. Tony agreed. Within an hour, Rivka arranged to meet them inside an abandoned railway station outside Baltimore. The station had long since fallen into disrepair. Broken windows allowed sunlight to spill across cracked concrete platforms. Tony searched the area carefully. No movement. Ziva remained cautious. That means nothing. Minutes later, footsteps echoed through the empty station. An older woman wearing a dark coat emerged from the shadows. Ziva. Rivka. The two embraced briefly. Tony extended his hand. It's been a long time. Rivka smiled. I remember hearing stories about you. I hope the good ones. There weren't many. Tony sighed dramatically. I figured. Even Ziva laughed. Mercer handed Rivka the encrypted drive. She connected it to a secure tablet and silently reviewed several files. Her expression quickly changed. This is authentic. Tony's heart sank. No doubt? None. She looked directly at Ziva. These documents expose an organization that has operated in complete secrecy for decades. Can we stop them? Rivka answered honestly. Only if the evidence survives. Suddenly, every light inside the station went dark. The emergency generator shut down. Silence. Then, a red laser beam appeared across Rivka's chest. "Sniper!" Tony shouted. He tackled Rivka behind a concrete pillar just as a rifle round shattered the wall where she had been standing. The station erupted into chaos. Masked operatives stormed both entrances, armed with suppressed rifles and tactical gear. Tony fired twice, forcing the lead attackers into cover. Ziva moved with flawless precision, protecting Mercer as they retreated deeper into the station. One attacker reached the platform. Before he could raise his weapon, Ziva disarmed him with a swift counterattack and sent the rifle sliding across the floor. Tony caught it effortlessly. "Still impressive," he called. "You sound surprised." "I've learned not to be." The gunfire suddenly stopped. An eerie silence settled over the station. Then a familiar voice echoed through the building. "Tony!" He froze. "I know that voice." A tall figure stepped from the shadows, his face hidden beneath a black hood. When he lowered it, Tony's expression turned to disbelief. "It can't be." The man smiled coldly. "It has been a long time, Dinozzo." Ziva's eyes narrowed. "You know him?" Tony never looked away from the stranger. "I thought he was dead." The man took another step forward. "No. I've simply been working in the shadows." He raised a small remote control in his hand. "You've spent years chasing criminals." He smiled again. "Now you're finally chasing the people who created them." Before anyone could react, he pressed the button. A deafening explosion rocked the far end of the railway station, collapsing steel beams and filling the air with smoke and debris. As Tony pulled Ziva to safety, the mysterious stranger vanished into the chaos, leaving behind only one terrifying realization. The conspiracy reached far deeper than they had ever imagined, and someone from Tony's past had just declared war.